Under a sky ripped open by storm, the forest held its breath. Wind drove rain like needles, and every branch shivered with a nervous kind of life. Mud sucked at Ilara's feet as she ran, raw earth clutching her like hands that did not want to let go. Her side burned where claws had raked through skin. The pain was hot and bright, a brand that kept her awake when the world begged her to fall. She moved anyway because stopping meant teeth. Stopping meant home had turned into a hunting ground, and the hunters knew her name better than they knew their prayers. The night had a pulse. Thunder rolled from ridge to ridge, a dark drum calling old things to attention. Far off, wolves answered, a layered chorus, disciplined and sure. Not strangers. Not rumor. Pack, her pack. The sound hit bone before it reached her ears, and her heartbeat stumbled to catch up. The storm made a theater of everything. Trees bowing, leaves writhing, water chasing its own reflection down the slope. Lightning stitched jagged seams through cloud. And for seconds at a time the forest went silver white, a photograph mid-scream. She ran through those flashes, a smear of breath and bare feet. A girl whose body had learned to move in silence even when silence felt like a lie. She kept one hand pressed to her ribs. Warmth slicked her palm. Every exhale was a small fire breaking loose in her chest. She tasted iron, tasted old smoke that wasn't there, tasted all the memories that wouldn't wait for daylight. They had said she was cursed, and the word had followed her like a shadow too stubborn to belong to light. They had said the curse would eat her first, then the rest of them. She had believed parts of it, on nights when power sparked down her arms like a song she could not stop singing. But tonight the truth was simpler. That brand of fear curse was the reason her legs still moved. The reason she knew which way the ground tilted, which way the wind would carry scent, which way to dive when the branches started to speak like voices. She cut left through a thicket that tried to comb the skin from her shoulders. The storm's breath shoved at her back, unfriendly and personal. A root rose like a knuckle in the dark, caught her foot and threw her into the mud. The fall yanked a groan out of her throat that sounded like someone else's pain. She stayed down, face pressed to earth, listening with the full length of her body. Thunder, rain, the careful crack of a weight, settling on bark somewhere behind an upslope. One, maybe two. Trained not to call attention. Trained to circle and close. The howls had cut off. Pack silence always meant focus. The chase was no longer a sport. It was a decision. She dragged herself forward into the crawl that had saved her more times than she could count. Mud coated her belly, slid cold under her nails, smeared the heat of the wound until the body guessed it might live. She found the fallen trunk by smell-wet rot old moss, the clean metallic bite of lichen when rain first wakes it. She slipped under, ribs screaming, and curled into the smallest shape a human could be without forgetting how to breathe. Bark pressed rough against her cheek. Her heart tried to punch its way out of her mouth. She swallowed and swallowed again until the beat settled somewhere that felt less like a target. Shadowed. Figures moved beyond the veil of rain. Ilara could not see faces, only the logic of bodies, the way shoulders rolled, the patience in their steps, the shared rhythm that belonged to wolves who had practiced losing and never learned how. They passed like a lesson. One paused, lifted a head to scent the air, and for a breath she witnessed the moment her story could end. Wind pivoted. Rain hammered the leaves hard enough to rewrite tracks in the dirt. The figure moved on. Their silence gathered itself up and went away. Ilara lay still until the earth stopped feeling like a drumskin under her ribs. Then she counted to a number her mother had once used to measure fear, high enough that a child would get bored and forget why she was afraid, low enough that danger would still respect the attempt. Her lips moved without sound. When the number ended, she let time add its own handful for good measure. The night, easily insulted, decided to keep its secrets. She slid out, every muscle tight, a living bruise stitched together by stubborn breath. The storm shifted its weight. Lightning showed her a brief world of clean edges, a path for deer, the knifed faces of rocks, a shallow dip where water collected in a trembling skin. And in the cut of that white light, Something that did not belong to the forest lay folded into the snowpack that clung in patches where the wind could not reach. A body. Massive, even broken. Fur that should have been black looked like wet slate. A flank rose and fell in a slow, sullen tide. And around the ribcage, the snow had gone the high, wrong shimmer of silver blood. She should have left him. Survival has rules, and most of them involve walking away from tragedies that already picked the time and place. But her feet knew another rule, older and less wise. When something living trembles, you look closer. She approached in halves, breath measured into the smallest parts it could be, and still count for life. The wolf filled space the way mountains do, as if they existed first and the world learned to be around them. He lay on his side with one foreleg curled, the other dragged out as if reaching for something he had not found. His ribs were a map of old scars, narrow and pale against the storm-dark pelt. Fresh wounds cut through those crossroads, deep, clean, deliberate. A blade, not a branch, not an accident. Whoever had intended this damage had done it with knowledge. That thought moved through Alara like a suspicion becoming a belief. She knelt just outside reach of those jaws. Even half dead, a wolf this size could rewrite anatomy in a heartbeat. His breath fogged the cold in ragged bursts. A whine lived at the edges of each exhale, unvoiced, but stubborn. She could feel the pain coming off him the way heat radiates from stone after sunset. The silver that bled from him pooled in a foil-bright puddle that mirrored lightning in tiny, broken flashes. She had heard stories about blood like that. None of them belonged to enemies she wanted to meet. Rain had washed the smell of him into something clean with iron underneath. She tensed, waiting for her fear to drive her back. It didn't. Fear adjusted its shape to match a different urgency. Her hands moved before the rest of her decided it was a good idea. She tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt, ignoring the teeth of the cold. Fabric gave under wet fingers with the sound of a secret being told at last. She slid closer on her knees, mud swallowing them warmly, as if be kind to this one reckless thing. Her palm hovered over the wound. Edges gaped. The meat of him was shockingly red under the silver wash, alive in a way that almost felt like hope. She pressed the fabric hard, and his body jerked, a tremor that passed from shoulder to paw. The growl that came with it was ruined, a frayed rope of sound, but inside it lived the warning of something that would never forget its own strength. She kept the pressure steady, eyes on the rise and fall of his ribs, voice quiet only in her mind, naming any god that might be close enough to feel flattered. Thunder dropped a mountain into the sky. The rain thickened to a curtain. Alara felt for where the artery tried to spill the world, found the beat with her fingers, and leaned her weight into stopping it. Blood fanned heat up her arms, slid into old scars on her wrists like it wanted to learn the shape of her. She did not flinch. The forest breathed around them in giant, patient lungfuls. Wind kept changing its mind. She kept hers. The wound slowed under her hand. Not stopped, nothing that easy, just slowed, as if the body beneath her palm recognized that not everything touching it wanted to take. The wolf's eyes were closed, but then they opened as if the storm itself had called them. Gold, not the friendly kind from candlelight. Ancient, deep, layered like hammered metal that had seen war and wedding both. They cut through rain and found her. Names are a kind of power, and something moved through that gaze that felt like a name remembered. The gaze did not ask. It weighed, measured, recorded. Then it softened by a fraction that would not matter in any other life. It mattered here. Ilara's breath went uneven. The distance between them rearranged into something with edges that fit. Hands numb from cold and from holding on too hard. She shifted the fabric, wrapped, cinched, tied. The strip soaked through to mirror, and still she kept going until the wound looked less like an open door. Her own blood from the side wound had slicked her fingers. When her skin slid against his, something changed. It came without announcement, a faint warmth rising under her palms, a hush that settled into the sound of the rain as if rain had always planned to share. Light threaded through the skin of her hands in a thin, steady glow. Not bright enough to call attention from a distance. Bright enough to claim intimacy. She knew this. Had feared it. Had used it to save a bird once and spent a week shaking. The light traveled from her hands into him, not rushed, not begging, just present. A candle carried into a dark room that already knew the furniture. The muscle under her palm eased from stone to something like stubborn flesh. The bleeding, already slowed by pressure, answered the glow with a reluctant patience, then with calm. Elara breathed for both of them until her head went light. The wound knitted at its edges, not a miracle, not a story made simple, but a motion toward survival that the body ultimately decides. It was enough to keep him. Enough for the next minutes. Enough for whatever waited above them that had not yet chosen to look down. He moved his head. Not much. Just enough to remind the world of scale and intention. His nose found the air near her wrist, and the breath that reached her skin sounded like a map folding. She did not pull away. The gold of his eyes held her in the patient grip of someone who had learned to let instinct and intelligence debate in private. The weight of that gaze had a shape, and it settled on her as if returning to a place it recognized by touch alone. Some part of him gathered itself and spoke. Not to the air, not to the rain, but into the small space between his mouth and the pulse in her wrist. A whisper, ruined by pain, carried on a breath that shouldn't have been capable of language. He said her name. Not the one the pack had used like a complaint, not the one strangers turned into a question, but the name as it had once meant promise. He could not have known it, and still he did. Heat went through her like a confession. The forest tilted and then steadied. She did not answer out loud. The narrator of her body spoke in other ways. The way her shoulders lowered, the way her jaw unclenched, the way her fingers gentled their hold without letting go. The storm tossed another armful of rain into their circle and received no thanks. The Wolf's eyes fell shut again, not in surrender, but in a trust so conditional it felt like war. She checked the binding, adjusted the knot with hands that had learned to learn by failing, and kept watch while minutes gathered into a fragile shelter. Lightning forked above the canopy. And for a breath the forest looked like a cathedral that had forgotten the word holy. Elara tracked the spaces between thunder, listening for footfall woven into weather. The pack's silence still lay heavy, but the wind told a different truth. Their trail had veered downslope, pulled by the river's clean noise and the easy lie of flat ground. The hunters were off by enough. Time opened a narrow door, not a guarantee, just a chance. She tucked it into the place where courage sleeps when it feels uninvited. The cold came in waves that made no sense. Her skin burned where the wound bled, then went chill as if rain lived inside her bones. She shifted into a crouch to share her body heat with the Wolf without understanding how absurd that looked. He had the weight of a myth and the gravity of a throne even bleeding into the snow. She had muscle and refusal. The two met like equals because she decided they would. The world often yields to that kind of decision. Her thoughts kept trying to walk back into the house she had left. Doors slammed. Voices rose. Judgment wears the same face in every season, and tonight it had learned to run. They had said dangerous. They had said liability. They had said shame with a care that made it sound like concern. And because language can make lies sound true, she had almost believed them. Almost. But the moment her palms lit with that threaded glow and the blood beneath her hand agreed to survive. Something old and quiet inside her answered to a different name. Wind shifted again, bringing the river's voice and the metallic promise of stone. They would need shelter. Time measured itself in risks. She rubbed muddy hands against her thighs, steadying them, then studied his body like a problem she meant to solve. Moving him would cost more than it gave if she chose wrong. Not moving him would invite everything that liked the smell of weakness. She stood, looking for a place that offered cover, an angle of ground she could use, a shallow cave, a fallen tree with the right geometry. The storm obliged by revealing, in one adhesive flash of light, the dark mouth of a rock overhang a dozen paces uphill. Half choked with ferns and the husk of last year's leaves. She went to the overhang first, testing the floor with her heel. Checking the headspace, the driplin, the softness of the mud. Dry patches hugged the back wall where stone ran like a spine. A tangle of roots offered loops a hand could trust. The place smelled of earth that liked its own company. Good enough, if she could bring him back beside him. She knelt and touched his shoulder with the careful respect of someone approaching a cliff edge. He shuddered once, eyes flickering open to that chambered gold. A furnace turned low. She showed him the overhang with a tilt of her head and an open palm, a gesture that asked and promised without pretending to command. Pain cleared some of the fog in his gaze. He gathered his chest beneath him and tried to rise. He did not succeed the first time. Power moving through injured muscle looks like memory. Alara slid her shoulder under his neck, braced her feet, and gave him the kind of help that is mostly presence. He levered himself half up, paws skidding in the slick, then found traction. His body trembled with effort, but the spine remained a statement. Together, though that word felt too small for what happened, they crossed the short, brutal distance. Each step had to be purchased. Each pause had to negotiate pride. She kept count with breath, and when that failed, with the small numbers people save for pain, inside the overhang the rain became rumor. The air held its own temperature. She eased him down onto the driest patch, then moved quickly through a list that had no room for panic. Clear debris. Build a low barrier of stones at the mouth to break the wind that wandered in looking for whose story to carry. Tuck her own body as windwall where the barrier failed. Tighten the makeshift bandage. Press again to call her glow. She obeyed that call, and the light answered, soft as before, enough to soothe the raw edges where flesh argued with itself. The storm's voice changed key. Distant thunder rolled like old furniture being dragged across a floor in another house. When she dared, she let herself lean back against the stone. The rock's chill drained some of the heat from her wound, and dulled the throb to something that felt less like a demand and more like a request. She watched him breathe. She counted. The rhythm was wrong but not doomed. Every few breaths his ears twitched toward noises only he could interpret. He had the look of kings in old stories, the ones who understood solitude as a weapon they could carry without using it to cut themselves. She tried to imagine the hands that had put those clean cuts in his side. Knives wielded by certainty. Warriors who set out to remove a piece from the board and almost succeeded. The pack would say this was not her problem. The pack would say everything until a better voice spoke. So she spoke to herself in the language of purpose. The man-wolf had fallen into her night, and she had pressed her hands to his life until it answered. That answer made her responsible. Responsibility is another word for power when it chooses not to be grand. The rain decided to remember kindness for a while. It softened into a steady hush that sounded like a promise you might keep if morning showed you how. Alara closed her eyes for 3 breaths, then opened them again because sleep, even the kind that comes in blinks, teaches bodies to be still, and stillness was the enemy of tonight. She watched his chest. The rise grew smoother by degrees, too fine for anyone else to notice. The glow under her skin had faded into memory, but if she pressed her palms together she could feel it waiting. Not greedy, not nervous, prepared. She checked the world outside their shelter. The storm had moved off to argue with a different ridge. The wind thinned to a breeze that advised discretion. The pack's howls rose again. Farther now. A disciplined roll call that ensured everyone knew where to be fierce in the morning. Sound carries truth, and this truth said, not now. The river turned itself up slightly to keep secrets. The trees went back to the work of being massive in a way that comforted smaller things. Alara studied the line of his jaw where fur thinned to skin, and the scars that crossed there like a history lesson. She had not meant to notice how his mouth seemed built for both command and silence. She had not meant to see the dignity in the way he fought to keep still, because stillness is also strength when pain is loud. But nights like this do not respect intention. They ask you to learn what you see, or else you do not get another night. Her mother's voice surfaced, not as sound but as the physical memory of a hand guiding her wrist away from a candle's flame. Caution had saved them once. Courage would need to do the saving now. The names of those ideas get used as if they disagree, but in her body they had always collaborated. She let them confer again, sitting motionless as the man-wolf's breath smoothed and the wound held. He had whispered her name. That knowledge circled in her chest like a bird looking for the exact shape of a branch. She refused to be afraid of the recognition. Fear is not the same as respect, and she had learned to give respect first, even to danger, so she could see it clearly enough to survive it. The night thinned. Hours cannot be persuaded to stop, even for the desperate, and dawn always begins its campaign before anyone agrees to receive it. Gray gathered in the seam where ground meets sky. The cold decided bones deserved to be noticed. Alara flexed her fingers, felt the grit embedded in every line of skin, and wondered briefly what she looked like from the outside. A girl with blood on her hands, mud on her knees, and nothing familiar left but her own refusal to abandon the living thing in front of her. It would have to be enough that he woke fully with a hitch in his breath that would have shattered a weaker body. Gold eyes found her again, the pupils narrowing and widening as if testing how this reality held. The snarl that might have greeted a stranger did not arrive. Instead, some private accounting moved behind his gaze and allowed her to remain. The muscles in his foreleg tensed and released, a small rehearsal for a large emotion. She lifted her palm, slow and empty, to the level of his eyes, then lowered it to rest over her own wound. He tracked the gesture with the precise curiosity of a predator taught to notice everything. She felt foolish for wanting him to understand what the motion meant, that she hurt too. That pain had made them neighbors whether either of them had asked. The answering shift in his gaze told her foolishness had its own kind of logic. Understanding passed between them without ceremony. The forest did not applaud. The rain did not lean in. It didn't need to. Some agreements are their own witnesses. She rechecked the bandage. Blood seep had slowed to a sullen damp. The edges of flesh, once parted like a red mouth, now pressed together with the stubbornness of bodies that prefer wholeness when given the chance. She pressed her palm lightly and let the latent warmth from her skin persuade cellular arguments to rest for a while. The glow stayed quiet but present, like memory humming under a closed door. Her ears caught a noise upstream, an unhelpful rock arguing with a current. A small slide of wet leaves from a branch resigning itself to gravity. Nothing that carried the pattern of approach. She let her breath lengthen by one beat, then another, the world permitting it. He adjusted his weight and managed to tuck his forepaws beneath his chest with the solemn dignity of someone returning to his own name. The storm had scoured scent from the air, but close as they were, his smell reached her, a mix of rain-cooled fur, iron, and a dark heat she could not define without using words that made her feel like she was pretending to be older. She allowed the recognition anyway. Names for truths did not make them less true. She did not lean closer. She simply did not lean away. He listened to that too. Somewhere below, the pack called another roll. Discipline, precision. The sound did not rise to the overhang like accusation now. It rose like the closing of a door that had been left open by mistake. Alara felt the space inside her widen, not relief, not safety, but room. Room to make the next right thing without the immediate threat of being corrected through blood. Room to consider a future that existed beyond the next breath. Her hands began to shake only when she realized she had permission to stop holding them still. The tremor started in the small muscles and worked outward until she pressed her palms against the stone to set a boundary for it. She let it pass through her without apology. Strength that refuses to shake is often just pride wearing a borrowed coat. She took the shaking as proof she was still in her body and not just the idea of it. The Manvolf watched without judgment. His eyes softened again, the metal of them warming in a way that made the overhang feel briefly like a room with a fireplace. The impossibility of that feeling lodged under her breastbone. A laugh tried to rise, the kind that visits when exhaustion realizes it can still find a game to play. She did not let it out. Laughter is a luxury that can call attention when attention kills. She stored it with other small, bright things for later. Dawn drew a thin line across the trees, then thickened it. Color returned to the world in careful layers. First a charcoal whisper, then smoke. Then the reluctant blue that always arrives after storms, as if the sky is embarrassed about what it said the night before. Birds offered a few experimental notes in case the day accepted them. It did. Elara knew what daylight meant. Sight lines, tracks made obvious, wounds telling their stories in the honesty of morning inspection. She also knew that if any of her hunters found a trail of silver, curiosity would grow legs. The overhang concealed them from a casual glance but could not hide scent forever, not from trained noses. Movement would have to happen, not now, but soon, before hope became laziness. She measured the angle of the slope, the scrub between here and a stand of firs that knit their branches into a hiding place. She imagined the arc of their path, how to step, where to pause, when to breathe. Plants do not guarantee survival. They simply refuse to hand it over. She checked him one more time. The wound held. The eyes, when they closed, did so with the control of a soldier allowing rest to sit beside him like a stranger he might someday call friend. She eased away, inch by inch, to scout the mouth of their little shelter. The wind touched her cheek with a new, clean snow from peaks beyond sight, the high mineral tang of stone that had never learned the word soft. A good wind. It would steal their story and scatter it where no nose wanted to follow. When she turned back, he had lifted his head in a move he must have known would find her with every sense. The smallness of the overhang made the moment intimate by necessity. She looked at him as a person looks at the truth when they finally get tired of arguing with it. He looked back as if he already knew the conversation's end. Neither of them moved first. Minutes, thin as glass, passed without breaking. Then the slow weight of decision settled into her knees. She knelt, reached for the bandage, and brushed her fingertips along the edge of his fur, letting him know she was there and that being there came without an agenda besides the obvious. He endured the touch the way kings learn to endure counsel, annoyed at the inconvenience, aware of the necessity. She unknotted the strip enough to test the resilience of the closure beneath. The skin had sealed in places that mattered. He did not bleed because she wanted him not to. He did not bleed because his body desired to go on. The glow rose in her again, that small lamp carried behind the ribs. She guided a thread of it through her palm and into the wound. Not to force, just to persuade. The thread answered, warm and even, like a friend choosing to sit beside her. The change it made would not show until later, when movement demanded proof, and the body had to decide whether to pay now or pay with interest. She gave him what she could to lower that interest. The rest would be up to his own relentless will. Outside, daylight shook itself fully awake. The forest appeared honest in the way only morning can make it. Elara knew honesty does not equal safety, but it does make lies easier to see. She sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on a cleaner patch of shirt, then took the kind of breath that makes room for what comes next. They would move. They would follow the curve of the hill into cover. They would use the wind's favor until it changed its mind. And if the pack found them anyway, then the rules would bend or break with whatever she had left to bend or break them. For now, this moment still belonged to quiet, and quiet needed attention to be worth anything. She looked at him one more time. Not at the blood, not at the scars that made a mythology of his skin, but at the whole of him. A life that had survived every kind of attempt to make it smaller than it wanted to be. Something answered that in her, an echo that did not sound like fear. It sounded like recognition passing from one relentless thing to another. She let the recognition sit. She did not decorate it with hope or ruin it with demands. She simply knew it and went on breathing. The forest examined them both and decided for now, to allow this strange arithmetic girl plus king plus wound equals a future neither could perform alone. The storm had written them into the same sentence. Weather ends. Sentences do not. Not when they are the kind you remember, and because not everything inside a dangerous life needs to be sharp. She allowed herself a small softness at the very end of the moment. A thought set down carefully where it would not interfere. That she had put her hands on a life everyone else had chosen to end. And the life had decided to stay. Beyond the overhang, a bird committed to its song, as if music were another way to say stubborn. Elara set her palm briefly to the rough warmth of his fur in a farewell to stillness. Movement waited outside like a promise that might yet behave. Might yet behave. She would stand. He would rise if he could. The day would test what night had made. Before she rose, The narrator in her blood remembered the people beyond the trees. The ones listening from rooms and buses and beds. The ones who carry their own storms in silence and wait for stories that make the waiting matter. The storm was passing, and the breath that filled her chest felt like something more than survival. It felt like a beginning that would not apologize for what it cost. Before the storm clears, don't forget subscribe to Crimson Moon by Benny, because here, every heartbeat tells a story that burns. Dawn thinned the storm into a pale curtain, and the forest stepped back to show its bones. Alara rose from the overhang with the steadiness people find when there is no other option to perform. She set a hand to the rock, then to the Wolf's shoulder, and the world answered with the hard honesty of mourning. The wound held. Breath moved through his ribs in a pattern that no longer sounded like an argument. Outside, the wind had shifted in their favor, shouldering their scent toward the ravine and away from the disciplined patience of the pack. She signaled movement with the simple language of body's weight forward. Chin lifted, breath measured. He accepted the choice without pretense. The first step carried the ache of effort. The second acknowledged that pain would travel with them but not command. They climbed the slope as if the hill had asked them to swear something, and they'd agreed. Bracken lashed her shins. Grit lodged in the cut at her side and reminded her of the limits she was pretending not to have. She adjusted her breath to keep the edges from fraying. He moved beside her with a deliberate control that disguised how much it cost. They made it to the first stand where branches braided into a dim green chamber and the ground took their weight without complaint. Needles softened each footfall. The canopy gathered the storm's leftover water and let it fall in narrow threads that did not interfere. Here the air carried a cleaner cold, the kind that lets decisions cool into something usable. Alara guided him to the quietest patch, and stood still long enough for her heart to learn the new rhythm of safety measured in inches. Sound changed. Not pack metal on bark, reinforced leather, the click of a buckle tested by habit. Soldiers moving like they were part of the weather. Not many. Efficient enough for a few to feel like a crowd. They were upwind, which turned their noses into decorations. But boots do not need scent when they have orders. The fur chamber contracted around Alara's lungs. She set her palm against the Wolf's neck, not to claim, not to soothe, but to anchor both of them against the fact that hiding and waiting are different skills. She tracked the approach in the small ways the world gives. Away intruders, a crow's disapproval, the abrupt hush of a vole, the slow tension sliding up the trunks. He tracked it too, but with a stillness that contained everything he intended to do next. When he moved, it would not be improvisation. It would be memory flexing. The first soldier broke the edge of the trees at a confident angle, scanning height before he considered ground, expecting prey that had forgotten how to look up. The second took the low path, weapon dull with use in the way that matters. The third held himself like a hinge meant to turn the others into a door. Alara measured distance to escape points that did not exist. She tasted iron under her tongue and knew it was not all memory. Her body wanted to run. Her mind answered with a refusal that made legs stronger. The Wolf shifted weight in a way that warned the air. He rose, not the slow, pained leverage of earlier, but a contained explosion that snapped him from recovery to purpose. The fur at his shoulders lifted like a storm revisiting the sky. The world narrowed to the vector between threat and response. He moved without sound toward the soldier on the low path, a streak of muscle that looked like intention becoming shape. The man had time to register a wrongness and nothing else. The impact folded him. Bones answered in the blunt language of physics. The Wolf tore once, then left the ruin behind to meet the hinge. Alara did not watch the rest the way a bystander watches something impressive. She watched like someone who understood what would be required of her in the second after the first mistake. The hinge turned as designed and met a jaw that closed on his wrist with engineering-level precision. His blade left his hand and jumped into the needles. Alara was already moving. She did not reach for the knife. She reached for the throat of the moment and squeezed. She hooked a foot behind the hinge's knee with the mechanic's exactness she had learned falling and getting up again, one motion to bend the problem, another to put it down before it remembered how to stand. He hit the ground with force that forced air from his chest and choice from his eyes. She followed through with a heel to the temple. It felt like kicking a locked chest and finding out it was empty. The third soldier height. Watcher adjusted in time to deserve credit. He lifted his crossbow into a sight line and drew breath for steadiness. The wolf was already on him, but space can be cruel even to speed. Ilara saw the calculus. Distance plus weapon plus heartbeat equals a bolt where a heart should not have to answer. She broke the equation. She moved into the sight line, not to catch the metal. It would make a hole either way but to foul the aim. The shot left the bow with the high dishonest wine metal uses when it wants to pretend it is neutral. It carved her sleeve and kissed skin hard enough to sting truth into the nerves without making a story of death. The wolf hit the shooter like gravity rediscovering a fallen stone. Silence followed. Heavy and sudden. The silences after violence always are. Ilara felt the next seconds looking at her, asking for orders. She had only one. She scanned the bodies for patches, rank marks, any icon that translated into orders given and received. The insignia bore the iron geometry of the northern banners, and beneath it a sigil she recognized from hearsay and warnings. The royal crest. She turned that knowledge over like a blade in her hand. Soldiers loyal to a missing king patrolling the storm's mess. Hunting pack sent and possibly hers. Or escorting another priority and answering to a different name for the same purpose. Either knowledge tied the present to something larger than three men in a choice. The wolf stood motionless amid the wreckage, breath calm enough to make a liar of the blood freckling his muzzle. Ilara saw it then, not only strength but a kind of economy. He had done exactly what survival required and nothing performative. No flourish, no cruelty, no apology. A leader's precision whispered inside the brutality. She read the shape of that precision across old scars arranged like chapters, each line telling where he had chosen to stand and what he had allowed to find him. He lowered his head, and the moment shifted. In the lowering lived acknowledgement that she had stepped into a lethal calculation and made a sum he could work with. Her arm burned where the bolt had grazed, a petty, mean fire compared to what lived in her ribs. She tore another strip from her shirt and wound it, not out of fear of bleeding out, but to remind the ache it served a larger body. The wolf moved closer. He pressed his nose to her wrist, inhaled once, and the weight of intent in that breath was not the appetite of a beast. It was appraisal of risk taken, of loyalty given without the formalities of oath. The shift came like weather inside him. Muscle rippled. Bone articulated a remembered configuration with the wonderless efficiency of a machine designed to perform one transformation perfectly. Foe receded in a tide. Shape changed but didn't disappear. It reorganized. Where a wolf had stood, a man unfolded from the end of a long sentence. He was not gentle work. He was built like a weapon taught manners. Height that made the fur chamber feel undersized. Shoulders stamped with labor and war. Skin mapped with scar tissue that looked repaired rather than ruined. The wounds from the night's attempt on his life still angry, bandaged dark from a war it had nearly lost. The eyes remained gold, but in a human face they turned complicated in a way wolves do not trouble themselves to be. He faced her without the ritual of thanks or the debt's theatrics. He looked at her like a man forced to reassess an equation he had previously solved. She saw the moment recognition bridged what he had inferred in the snow to what stood breathing in front of him now. He let breath fill his chest, then shaped it into words that she did not hear as sound so much as the impression words leave behind once they have been spoken. He warned that she should not have touched him. Not because she had broken a rule, but because now the world would look for the mark that kind of touch leaves. And if the world could not find it on him, it would find it on her. She felt the truth of that pass through her like weather. Regret did not follow. You do not regret stopping blood when the alternative is a body becoming a story told in the past tense. She stood steady under his appraisal. He noticed the mark on her wrist, then the subtle crescent braided into the skin's undertone. The sign her mother had asked her to hide. The sign the pack had used to explain their fear. His eyes tightened at the edges. His posture altered by a degree that would not matter to someone untrained and meant everything to a person who knew that bodies never keep secrets. Alara watched him understand. She watched the change that followed the understanding. The flicker of calculation that weighs old prophecy against present evidence and writes a plan in the margin between. He told her, without bothering to make the telling kind, that he had been looking for her. Not a rumor. Not a guess. A hunt turned partnership by accident. The words fell into her like stones into a well. They made ripples that turned into rings of consequence reaching far beyond a first stand and 3 men cooling in needles. He stepped forward, and the chamber shrank. She stepped back, not from fear, but to keep room for choice. He halted and read the decision in her feet. There, in that earned pause, lived a new arrangement. 2 people accustomed to command learning not to issue it to each other. He took air into his lungs again, as if filing a report to his body about how this was going to go. Then, with the brusque grace of someone who detests theater but will wear it if it keeps the audience awake, he claimed what the night had made her life, not his property. But as a bond formed when her hands turned his death into a postponement, she didn't nod. She didn't resist. She let the claim exist without making it easier. The air seemed interested in the tension and held it aloft. Somewhere down the slope, the river signed its name against rock a little louder. Like the world wanted a record of this agreement whether either of them did. The wound at her side demanded what all wounds demand after adrenaline quits: respect paid in small, regulated movements. She turned her head and measured a path deeper upslope, toward the darker teeth of the mountain where caves wait for the right kind of desperation. He followed the line of her gaze and accepted the plan with a silent economy that said he had already thought of it and rejected it, for reasons that no longer applied. He retrieved a fallen cloak from one of the soldiers with the contempt of a man who knows what uniforms are worth and what they are not. He threw it across his shoulder, then, with a fractional hesitation that almost read as care, shifted toward her so the material sheltered both. Heat moved from him across the cloak's weave. It had the weight of a fact. And she allowed it because facts are simpler to manage than intentions. They traveled in stretches measured by breath counts, and the number of steps her ribs would let her take before something went dim and blue at the edges. He set the pace at the outer edge of what she could manage, which is the only respectful thing to do for someone built from refusal. At the boulder field, the world stiffened into a puzzle. He took the lead then, not to dominate but to translate stone. He chose footfalls that looked impossible and made them mundane, by putting weight on exactly the spots where the mountain expected it. She learned him in those choices, the way he spread risk evenly, the way he never asked a body to do something gravity would only mock dot at the mouth of the cave. The mountain received them like a grudging host. Cold slid under her skin and made a nest. The dark sniffed at their outlines and did not decide to bite. Inside the first chamber, water talked to itself in a low cadence from somewhere not far. The ceiling sent back their breaths with polite interest. He scanned the corners like a man who had waited for a blade to step out of shadow more times than he admitted even to himself. Satisfied, he moved to the pool where the drip gathered and used the cloak as a basin. He did not say he would help. He returned with water and the kind of attention that does not ask permission but listens for refusal. She gave none. He cleaned the graze on her arm first, working with a detachment that ended at the edges of her skin. His fingers were precise, the pressure exact. He checked her ribs with the practiced sin of a man who knows that pain tells the truth and lies at the same time. He was careful not to demand words from her face. She breathed steadily and let him read what he needed from the way her muscles adapted under his touch. When he finished, he turned the same care on himself without flourish. She watched him rewrap the wound she had first bound and saw how his hands preferred competence over comfort. The bandage went on tighter. His jaw unclenched by a small amount as the ache accepted that someone had taken charge. They sat with stone at their backs and the pool's small voice taking the edge off everything else. Outside, daylight had deepened into the honest blue that exposes every lie made during the night. Inside, time felt densified, reduced to the work of bodies recovering and minds taking measurements. Alara let her guard drop by a degree that would have stunned the version of her who had crawled under the fallen trunk. She studied him with the same discipline she used on maps and patterns of pursuit. He noticed. He said nothing. Not silence as weapon, but as allowance. She followed that allowance into a place she rarely visited when other people were present. The room in her chest where memory keeps its records. The first image arrived without knocking. The elder's hut caught like tinder because fear and a new spark don't negotiate well the first time they meet. She had been younger, and the world had felt both wider and meaner. Power had licked from her palms when she thought anger would keep the truth from her throat. Fire had answered the call with joy she did not share. The hut had burned with the kind of efficiency that embarrasses apologies. The elder had survived with a jawline of black and a new religion about her, and the pack had found itself a story it would enjoy retelling. She learned then the difference between intent and consequence, and how people preferred to be spared that distinction. Her exile had not been ceremonial. No cloaks, no chanting, no spectacle to make cruelty feel like courage. They had looked at her as if the ground under her feet could no longer be trusted and told her to make her mistakes elsewhere. She had left with the heavy grace of someone who had already rehearsed it in her head 100 times. On the ridge outside the village, her mother had stopped her with hands that trembled less than the air and given her a warning disguised as love. Hide the light, or those who fear what they cannot own will follow it. Alara had nodded, not in agreement, but because nodding lets a mother think her daughter heard what would save her. The mark on her wrist had burned under the bandage as if it resented the cloth. She let these scenes pass in front of her without devouring her. He sat in his own quiet and did not try to fix any of it, which allowed her to continue. She traveled the path between memory and skin until she reached the small place where people keep whatever stayed tender. No one had looked at her hands as a possibility ever since. No one had trusted her near anything that could burn if the wind got ideas. Now a man who wore power like it had grown from his bones had bled into her fingers and called that a reason to find her. The difference roared quietly in the cave. She spoke in the way a body speaks, when it has reached the point where silence stings more than disclosure. She told parts, not the whole, not to be coy, but because the whole is a violence you should never perform without consent from every voice it contains. She laid out the exile, the night watches, the practice of binding power into breath until breath was the only thing she trusted. He listened with an attention that did not wander, didn't flinch at the uglier edges, didn't soften at the ones pretending to be sharp. When she finished, he carried the words to his chest and placed them beside something he'd kept. There already, his version of a home ruined by duty. A crown made heavier by the idiot gravity of prophecy. The ache of his people learning to read his scars as narrative instead of warning, his eyes still that molten. Hammered gold shifted from their alert readiness into something warmer. The change was not melodrama. It was minor, and thus it mattered more. He said only enough to put a light down beside what she had offered. Those who feared her had feared what they could not control. He did not dress the thought up as consolation. He set it down as an inventory item, proof that he could see the difference between danger and the story told about danger. The cave let that truth sit. It grew slightly easier to stand inside their skins. The pool marked time. Alara let her head touch stone, and felt solidity push back against her like a promise to stay put. Sleep came for her the way sleep hunts those who don't invite it, stealthy, relentless, padding pockets for spare minutes and making them its own. She held it off for as long as she could because sleeping near a stranger with a reputation, like a thunderhead, is a learned foolishness. But bodies do what they must. Her eyes closed between one breath and the next. When it took her, it didn't bring rest. Nightmares enter through unguarded doors. Fire arrived first, no longer a metaphor or a story told about her behind hands. Flames bloomed with the appetite of a new idea. They moved through rooms that belonged to no one she recognized and also to everyone. Children cried without making sound. The way horror sometimes steals sound rather than letting it serve as an alarm. Smoke wrote curses in the air and called them warnings. She stood in the center and found her hands lit from within. Not golden now, but a cold silver that looked like mercy until it touched anything. Everything it touched forgot how to exist in its current form. She shouted without hearing the noise. She begged her own body to stop helping the fire. It didn't. The dream did what memory does when it wants to teach through punishment. It made her the architect of what she had sworn to survive. She woke with the sound you make when the heart outruns the lungs and refuses to slow. The cave was still there. The pool kept its voice. The dark did not add teeth. She could not convince her body of any of these facts. Panic built a small, efficient machine inside her and started pulling levers. She tasted salt and ash that did not belong to this place. Her hand flew blindly into the air to find proof of now. It hit warmth and steadiness. He had moved the instant her dream took the shape of threat. Not a lunge. Not a startle. A shift designed to say one thing: present. His fingers closed over hers with precision and restraint, giving her just enough pressure to name reality and not enough to make it into another weight she had to carry. The heat of his skin registered layer by layer until the panic machine's levers began sticking. He did not speak because words crowd small spaces. He let breath be the only sound they shared. He matched hers until matching became leading and leading became lowering. Her body listened and slowly forgave him for helping. The cave watched without comment. Ilara's eyes adjusted to the dark again. The shape of him beside her became a fact she could hold without flinching. Shame tried to creep in on its quiet feet. The shame that comes when strength stumbles under weight and worries it has embarrassed itself. She refused it entry. Trembling is not an apology. It is a relay between what was and what will be. She let the tremor finish the message. He kept his hand where it was until the message ended. When her breath had the dignity of rhythm again, she let her hand fall back to her own chest. He withdrew in a way that carried no offense and no triumph. The air thickened with the aftertaste of closeness. Neither of them seemed inclined to dilute it. The pool kept two people from mistaking the moment for something planned. It had not been. It had been a response to a body asking for proof of present tense. Sleep returned in a less hostile form. This time it felt like a truce signed with conditions. When she woke again, a paler light made an attempt at the edges of the cave mouth, the echo of day's persistence. He had shifted to sit watch near the entrance, profile cut into the gloom like a coin struck from old metal. He looked dangerous even resting, but not the chaos kind. He looked like what happens when danger chooses a cause and refuses to let mediocrity hold the leash. He heard her stir and turned enough for the gold of his gaze to find her. 1,000 decisions could have been in that look. Only one made itself visible: that the next hours would be spent keeping her alive whether she agreed or not. She examined the statement and chose not to argue with it yet. She would live. After that, the debate could begin. The mountain offered them the sound of wind reorganizing itself for the day's labor. In that noise, she could hear where patrols would go and where they would not. The pack's calls did not reach this altitude. Discipline has a range. She sat up and felt the bruise of every inch she had bargained the night before. He came to the pool again and brought water with a simple practicality that made gratitude unnecessary by making offense impossible. She drank. The cold woke things that had decided to lie down forever. They planned without the theater of planning. She named the ridge she wanted, the shadow line she intended to follow, the stream that would dirty their tracks with its own fiction. He named the outposts where a lookout might have lost his edge, the shelters nobody used because superstition had declared them exhausted. Their knowledge built a bridge over the gap between two different kinds of survival. By the time they stood, it felt less like a bargain struck under duress, and more like an alliance refused a formal name. She gathered the cloak and allowed it to cover them, both again for the first stretch. Outside the cave, the mountain gave them views it had the right to keep, a valley stitched with fog, the river shining like a blade too far away to cut. A line of riders on the lower road moving as if their orders had come from a ghost. They moved uphill against the easy logic of escape because easy logic is where traps prefer to live. He set an angle that put them against the wind and the mountain's mood at once. She matched it because matching did not feel like surrender. It felt like choosing to live. As they climbed, her thoughts returned uninvited to the words he had left at the first stand, that he had been looking for her. The sentence carried weight she did not yet understand. Looking not for a rumor to extinguish or a weapon to disarm, but for a person whose hands had lit through skin and altered his fate. He had spoken her name in the snow before he had ever seen her face as a woman. Names know each other sometimes before mouths do. The mark on her wrist ached like a weather bone. She remembered her mother's last look, the way pride and fear can live in the same pair of eyes without canceling each other. Hide your light, she had said. Live quiet. Live small enough that hunters forget you taste like a promise. Alara had tried. The world had not cooperated. Now a man with a kingdom on his shoulders and a wound in his side had found her in a storm and claimed the right to stand where danger fell. She should have felt trapped. Instead, something inside that had always been ready for an argument discovered it wanted a conversation. They reached the ridge and found the trail that only animals use when weather tells them to be clever. The ground there was stitched with old tracks smudged by the storm into a language no one bothers to read. The trail skirted a stand of stunted pines and dropped into a saddle that hid them from the world's lazy gaze. Midway across, her legs sent up a brief revolt. He noticed before pride could shame her into pretending. He paused without turning, which made the mercy digestible. She counted out 10 breaths into her ribs and then motioned with her hand for the next push. He obeyed, and the mountain allowed it. By the time the sun convinced the sky to give it any real estate, they had reached a second cave, smaller and less romantic than the first. It smelled of old ice and the indifferent patience of stone. They collapsed into it like people who understood the day had been generous and might withdraw that generosity without notice. He sat, back to the wall, eyes on the mouth of the cave. She lowered herself carefully onto a flat rock and let her muscles be honest about hating her. The ache hummed at a low frequency that felt like a vow. She did not argue. You do not argue with a body that has carried you out of a night like that. The quiet there did not invite speeches. It invited truth of a lower wattage. She took it. She told him the last thing her mother had said, about hiding light. She told him how she had obeyed it until the obeying turned into another kind of wound. She told him about learning the very precise art of being unremarkable. How she had crafted a life from small kindnesses and large avoidance. How the forest knew her footfall now, and how the river kept her secrets like a friend who doesn't gossip because gossip bores it. She told him about the nights when the light pushed against her skin from inside, asking to be let out like a child with the wrong timing. How she had sat on her hands literally and figuratively to keep the village safe from the part of her that would not be argued into silence. He listened like a man, appraising a weapon and deciding not whether to use it but whether to deserve it. When he finally set words into the air, they came in an even cadence that lent them authority without strain. Those who had exiled her had been driven not by wisdom, but by the preference for predictable harm over unpredictable help. He did not name them cowards. He called them people, which landed like a deeper indictment. He said that what cannot be controlled is often exactly what is required to survive the day no one planned for. He said they had arrived at such a day. The words should have made her feel like a tool. Instead, the recognition slid over old bruises and did not press. His gaze, when it found her again, carried nothing of ownership and everything of calculation that includes respect in the math. She could see, now that the cave's gloom had learned their shapes, the fatigue in him, how the wound took tiny bites out of his focus, and he took them back one by one. He was missing, the world said. Gone. The banners whispered. Lost to enemies or to his own pride, the rumors enjoyed. Here he was, breathing, dangerous, looking for her in the definite way that makes rumors shut up. She slept then without the violence of before. The dream found her but chose different weapons. This time she stood not in fire but in a field glazed with frost under a moon that watched without blinking. Wolves ringed the open space 50, 100, eyes a map of their own ruin and their own salvation, depending on who counted. She entered the circle and drew her hands out of her sleeves. Light answered. Not devouring silver, not storm. A steadier flame, not to destroy, but to mark. The wolves bowed their heads, and the wind moved through her hair as if practicing how to carry a crown without assuming she would accept it. When she woke, the taste of that cold was still in her mouth. Memory and prophecy sometimes share a closet. He had slept and woke and taken a watch and woken again in the rhythm soldiers and kings share, when they pretend they are not the same thing. The mountain shifted light along the cave floor like a compass explaining itself. He caught her gaze and held it. No speech. No vow. Just the recognition of two trajectories deciding whether collision means ruin or rebirth. Hunger entered the conversation. He answered it with rations he pulled from a pouch that had seen more countries than most men. Dried meat, dense bread, something bitter that kept hands steady. He portioned without pageantry, eating little, insisting on nothing, indifferent to etiquette because hunger doesn't respect it. She ate the way a person eats when she knows what food is for. Fuel went to work. Thought sharpened. The day outside rearranged itself into hazards and corridors. She felt the need to tell him, something she had not intended to share, that there were days when she had wished her hands were just hands, and not gates. That there were nights when she had whispered requests into the dark, asking for smallness like a gift, and the dark had said nothing because the dark cannot lie but it also cannot flatter. That she had lain awake and made her body a quiet church where grief could come and kneel and at least feel seen. He accepted this too, not with sympathy, which presumes distance, but with the dry comprehension of someone who had prayed for less and been given more. He shifted, and the wound dragged his breath sideways for a beat. She reached without thinking, a palm to his bandage, and the light threaded up through her skin again without asking for permission, because some permissions are wasted time. Heat flowed into the torn muscle, and the meat answered with a loosening that bordered on gratitude. He allowed the help without turning it into theater or renaming it obligation. She could feel under her hand how his body had been trained to endure by clenching. She asked it to try a different method. It considered. It agreed in parts. The rest would take another day. The light dimmed on its own and behaved in the quiet afterward. He looked at her wrist again. Not the bandage. The mark beneath. He did it with the restraint of a man who knows that staring is a theft. She let him. The cave seemed to lean in as if the mountain wanted to read this part of the story closely. The mark was small. It always had been. It did not need to be larger to carry the weight of everything written about it by people who enjoyed the idea of destiny more than they had ever enjoyed a person. He seemed to arrive at the same conclusion that thousands of words carved into rock had tried to teach less efficiently. The size of a sign and the size of its meaning have never needed to agree. Outside. A hawk wrote loops over the saddle, hunting something that should have stayed hidden and didn't. The sound of its wings made a syncopation of the day. He stood with an unwilling grunt and moved back to the cave mouth. She followed, not to guard him, not to prove anything, but because being near the door gives you a better angle and possibility. The view had clarified. Trails showed their intentions. The lower road had acquired more riders. The fog shredded itself on the black spruces and revealed a column, bearing banners that did not respect humility. He named what she was seeing. Royal Guard, not patrol. A retinue that travels when a return is expected or a body is being retrieved. He did not add what she thought it was. He did not need to. The way his fingers tightened against the rock spoke the answer plainly. She watched his mouth set to a line that would make negotiations honest. He had not run from his crown. The crown had been taken from him by force that assumed it understood his limits. It had calculated without including a woman in the woods who would put her hands in a stranger's blood until death. It would have to wait its turn. She felt the pull inside her of everything larger. Prophecies with language like teeth. Old symbols that fit her wrist without asking. Stories that wanted to use a girl to make themselves feel inevitable. She also felt the pull of everything smaller. Quiet water. A bandage correctly tightened. Two bodies learning breath in the same room. Balance is never a permanent state. It's a thing you do on purpose until something makes you stop. She would keep doing it. He seemed ready to join her. Toward evening, the cave learned gold along its edges. The light touched his face and made the scars less severe by refusing to hide them. He turned to her as if concluding an internal debate.
Without speaking, he made the kind of vow that is not a chain.
He would see her through to the next point on the map where a different kind of choice could be made.
He would keep his soldiers from finding her before.
She found herself inside this new role the world wanted to drape over her shoulders. He would hold long enough for her to decide whether to accept any of it.
The vow lay between them without ceremony, and because it had no ribbon around it,
she trusted it more. Night would require another shelter or the same one, and both had their risks. They stayed.
The mountain approved by not sending its colder relatives into the cave to dissuade them.
The pool kept watch with its small, competent voice.
She made a cushion of the cloak and found a position that let her ribs forget to complain for a few minutes at a time.
He took the outer spot again. A silhouette that taught the dark what outline to respect. Sleep came for her slowly,
like a tide reconsidering its own rules.
Before it took her, she thought of the people beyond the reach of this cave's echo, the ones listening.
Because they have their own marks and their own storms and their own hands that sometimes betray them and sometimes save kings.
She felt the line stretch from her chest to theirs, small and strong. It steadied her more than any prophecy.
The dream that night did not hurt. It taught.
She stood in an ancient forest that had never learned human names. A shrine lay a headstone stacked by a patience she could feel under her tongue.
Symbols cut into the rock hummed when she approached, not loud, but insistently, like bees that had been taught music. Her wrist ached in a circle.
She placed it against the cold where two lines crossed,
and the chill jumped into her bone and wrote something on it from the inside.
The pain was precise and therefore merciful. When she pulled back, the mark looked the same, but her body knew another story had been added to it. In the shadows, something older than wolves watched and did not interfere. The watching felt like approval withheld for her sake as much as for anyone else's. She woke with the kind of calm that does not require happiness to be real.
He looked over, measuring.
She nodded, and the nod covered enough ground that words would have tripped over it. Outside, a cloud moved off the face of the afternoon sun, and the valley turned briefly into a bright lie.
They both recognized it as such and did not forgive it for trying. They would descend, not to the road where banners performed, but to the seam where stone meets scrub and secrets learn to travel.
They would cut the column off at a place where a decision could be made without witnesses. He would allow his guard to see him alive at a distance and not catch him at close range. She would position herself where rescue looked like coincidence rather than fate.
It was not a perfect plan. It was an honest one. They prepared.
He adjusted the bandage again, hands sure. She secured the cloak in a way that turned it into a silhouette the eye loses.
He drew a blade from nowhere, and it fit his palm like an inheritance.
She tightened the strip around her arm and tested the depth of her breath.
The mountain felt their readiness and offered no omen. Good. Omens are noisy and often wrong. At the threshold. He paused.
Not for drama. For accuracy. He took one last reading of the wind, the light, the world's appetite for risk.
Then he moved and she moved with him. And the cave let them go like a teacher who sees that the lesson has left the room and will now be tested in the hallway. They
slid along the ridge until the road appeared. Below, in a scroll of dust and iron,
the royal guard rode with the unity of men who have practiced, making a single decision many times and getting paid for it.
At the center, a banner carried the crest that had glared at her from the first stand insignia. The sight lit an agreement behind his eyes that made his profile more dangerous. They timed it to the hawk's pass. To the shiver in the column where the path pinched. To the sound of a wheel on a cart chewing the same stone it had been chewing for years.
He revealed himself just enough that eyes would register him, and not enough that hands could claim him.
A murmur ran through the formation like a wire pulled taut.
The front rank checked its speed in a way that did not betray panic.
He stepped back into the scrub before the murmur could become command.
Men leaned from saddles, jaws slack enough to be human.
The captain snapped a word that tried to become order. Chaos breathed in through 100 noses and held. Alara watched from a cut in the rock. Body quiet, hands warmer than the air. The mark at her wrist alert but not intrusive.
She measured how far a decision could travel down the line before turning into an action, and she prepared to wound that travel if she needed to. He stood where he would be seen by exactly the number of witnesses required for rumor to become fact and still leave him free to set his own scene for the reunion that must come later. She admired the ruthless clarity of it without apologizing for the admiration. The captain spurred forward with the fury of a man who believed he had the right to be angry at miracles that refused to sign his ledger. He reached the pinch in the road and found it empty by inches. He swore in the dialect of soldiers and excellence. The column waited for a signal that would satisfy a story they would have to tell their families. No signal came. Instead, a decision exploded in the captain's eyes and collapsed into competence. He split the guard in three, one to reduce the loop ahead, one to search the slope, one to hold the road. He did it fast enough that Alara felt respect and dread in the same heartbeat. They withdrew from the ledge and cut up slope before dogs could be brought to ascent. The wind would try to erase but might not. The climb set Alara's ribs on fire again. He took her elbow just long enough to make the mountain feel less steep. She allowed it just long enough to accept that the gesture did not claim anything beyond the 30 seconds it occupied. At the top, the world widened again to include the kind of distance that makes pursuit expensive. They used it. They did not stop moving until the sun had turned thin and the sky had acquired that vacant look it loves before night brings personality. When they finally halted, it was at a ledge with a view that understood why people climb. The valley lay below like a map someone had redrawn to include every exit. She sank to the rock with the gracelessness of honesty. He stood with his face in the wind and let the air bark its cold into his lungs until decision tasted like metal instead of blood. He turned then and offered her a truth packaged like a choice. The world that had been content to ignore her would not be afforded that luxury any longer. Eyes had seen him alive, and in the space where power recalculates, her name would lift like smoke. He could not promise safety. He would not. He could offer a path that carried danger with a purpose larger than staying undead. He could teach the light in her hands to serve something besides fear and survival. She considered the truth without flinching. She pictured the smallness she had curated, the quiet life that had looked from the right angle, like peace. She placed it beside the man whose existence bent the day into a shape other people had to navigate. She did not romanticize either. Then she did the most dangerous thing a person like her can do. She listened to what her own heart wanted without letting terror interrupt. It wanted to stop hiding. It wanted to be used correctly. It wanted to put itself between a crown and death and tell both to behave. It wanted a story that would not be humbled into apology. She let the desire stand in the open for a count of 5. Then she nodded once, a small motion that rearranged the mathematics of more than one kingdom. He accepted the decision with the same composure he had used to accept help, pain, weather. He did not smile. He did not pretend this made anything easier. He simply adjusted his stance by a fraction to make room beside him for a force that had spent too long being told it was a problem. The mountain shrugged an avalanche somewhere distant as if to applaud without clapping. Night fell with less malice than the night before. The ledge kept the wind's roughest jokes below them. They shared the last of the rations and an understanding that sleep might not write kindness into their dreams, but it would pay down enough debt to let them move again. Before she lay down, Alara lifted her wrist and traced the mark with a finger. It did not flare. It did not hum. It felt like a door she could open herself when she chose. That detail mattered more to her than any prophecy ever could. In the dark, she let memory revisit one more room, a kitchen where a mother had sliced bread with the authority of a queen because feeding is the first law. The way light had fallen through the window and landed on flour on the table as if blessing it. The way her mother had laughed when Alara had argued about nothing because arguing felt like life. The way that laugh had held, for 1 second, a future no longer available. She carried that sound out onto the ledge and set it down beside the man who had been carved by a different kind of loss. Two griefs sat near each other and did not require translation. Her breath settled. His did too. The valley exhaled with them. Somewhere far off, an owl questioned the dark and liked the answer. Elara closed her eyes and felt the ground hold her as if it had decided for now. That she belonged to it as much as the trees and the stone and the wind that could be savage but, occasionally, turned helpful at exactly the right moment. When morning came, it would come with its list of demands. For tonight, the list could wait. The Alpha King, who had been missing because men who knew nothing of him had written him out of their plans, slept with his back to a world that would soon relearn his name. The girl the world had mislabeled a curse slept with light in her hands and purpose learning how to pronounce itself. Between them lay a narrow strip of rock that felt like a new country with no borders yet, only shared breath and a treaty written in the language of survival upgraded to meaning. North drew them the way tide draws a drowning moon, quietly, irresistibly, with a pull that lived under bone. Morning found them on the spine of a ridge where old pines held the wind like a psalm they refused to translate. Frost clung to needles and turned every breath into a small rehearsal for winter. They moved through it together, her steps learning the rhythm of his choices, his pace learning the limit of her wound and widening it gently without letting it tear. Below, the valley spread in patient grace. Above, cloud shredded itself on the mountain and let slender seams of blue testify that sky still existed somewhere. The path north was not a line, but a memory the forest expected certain feet to recall. Stones wore hollows where generations had paused to decide if faith or fear would go first. Elk trails intersected with human ones. Paw prints wrote side notes in a darker ink. The air changed without warning, catching the scent of lichens older than stories and the metallic taste of rock that had never met sunlight. With each bend, silence chose a new instrument whined in high branches. The padded thunder of far-off falls. The quiet arithmetic of her breathing learning to trust itself again. At first the whispers came like imagination's echo. A trick of fatigue and altitude pretending to be meaning. A syllable lived inside a gust and then fell apart. Her name arrived without lips to deliver it and then vanished into bark. She dismissed the first, then the second. Then the discipline of dismissal wore thin and she let the third whisper lay its cool palm against her jaw. Ancestors speak in weather when stone runs out of places to carve. She listened. The forest answered not with sentences but with arrangement, the way light gathered along one trunk while abandoning another. The way a crow cut the sky at the exact height memory preferred. The way moss brightened just enough to mark a choice. Her wrist warmed beneath the bandage in a circle no sun touched. In the underskin glow lived a question the body had carried since birth and never dared ask out loud. When her fingers brushed the rough cheek of a standing stone, inscriptions woke like embers engaging air. Characters older than her mother's oldest lullaby breathed into visibility and held. Lines curved in the thrift and elegance of a script invented by people who had nothing to prove. The glow answered the glow. She did not flinch. She placed her palm flat and let the stone read her. Meaning slid through her skin like water finding its level. The words did not become sound. They became understanding. The first truth arrived with that soft violence. The healer of the beast binds. More than flesh, she binds a crown forged from fire and fang. Not by possession, but by recognition. The image came with it, not pictured but felt. A circlet of molten silver cooling around a throat under moonlight while wolves held their breath and men learned reverence. She tried to step back from the knowing and the knowing held her with dignity rather than force. He watched without interrupting. The mountain made his face spare and severe. The light made his eyes admit their warmth anyway. He had brought her here not to convince, but to witness the proof he refused to take from anyone's mouth. When another stone warmed under her touch and new lines climbed from shadow into day, she understood why his certainty carried no arrogance. Prophecy had never been a threat to him. It had been a ledger detailing costs he had already begun to pay. Now the ledger wrote her into the column where debt becomes bond. The forest thickened into the threshold before the shrine. At first it looked like a mere refusal of trees to yield. Burls knotted into one another, roots braiding themselves into a barrier, branches hooking the air. Then the barrier relaxed and parted around them with the courtesy of a door that recognizes a key. Moonveil revealed itself slowly. No temple rose, no tower.
Only a basin of stone ringed by boulders whose faces had been weathered into the patient attention of guardians. Above, a hole in the canopy shaped like an eye allowed light in precise measure. A ring of water, thin as a circlet and clear as a lie made honest, ran around the basin's inner edge. Mist drifted from nowhere in particular and made everything feel not colder, but closer. The whispers grew coherent there, not in words but in weight. Footprints centuries old pressed up through the ground, as if eager to be stood in. She stepped into one without intending to, and the pulse in her wrist and the pulse beneath her feet aligned. Heat rose inside her, a steady, disciplined warmth that refused drama. The mark burned, but the burn chased numbness from places she had forced into quiet. She placed both hands on the altar stone at the center, a slab no larger than a table, and the inscriptions dormant at first lifted like breath-fogging glass. When she exhaled, the script brightened and held. Understanding came this time as a chord rather than a single note. Her bloodline stepped forward with its full name. The seal that had been whispered into existence and then smothered behind children's ears announced itself, like a bell rung in a compassionate cathedral. Alpha Queen had never meant a woman taking a man's throne. It had meant a force that steadies what tooth and will alone cannot. The crown had two halves, one earned by dominance, one earned by devotion. If either ruled alone, ruin followed. If both joined, the knight remembered how to bless. She tried to argue with the stone, and the stone respected the argument while declining to change its mind. Images opened too quick to be cruel. A hall lit by torches that loved their own smoke. Faces turned toward her in a way in equal measure. A throne shaped not like a seat, but like a listening place. Blood on steps, yes, but not the spectacle of slaughter. The cost of choosing. Moonlight flooded tile and made it silver. Wolves moved at shoulder height through the crowd with a gravity that shamed gossip into silence. In the far end of the vision, a war threatening like a storm that had spent generations rehearsing its entrance. Her throat tightened, not with fear of the enemy but with fear of being misused by those who pretended to be allies. She wanted to step back into anonymity. She wanted to return to the quiet geometry of survival and the honest labor of feeding the wounded and the mean facts of keeping herself intact. Her muscles prepared to execute the retreat. Her bones did not move. The stone did not permit it yet. More needed saying. The script darkened, layered, then formed a sentence too simple to evade. The one who bound the beast to life must bind herself to his burden, not as chain but as counterweight. She had already made the first half of the vow in the snow. Without knowing its language, he went to his knees because reverence required it and guilt insisted on it. The gesture looked wrong on a man who wore authority like a second spine, and exactly right on a creature who knew how to bow to what kept him alive. The guilt was not about prophecy. It was about the cost he had already asked of her without asking. He had brought danger like a cloak and draped it over her shoulders with nothing to offer in exchange except the truth. He bowed to the truth, which is what men like him do when the alternative is lying to themselves and then to everyone else. He did not touch her. The space between them took on the density of promise. The wind stepped through the hole in the canopy and tasted their hair. The water circlet murmured with the diction of mountain streams that have learned diplomacy. The altar softened its heat until it felt like a hearth rather than a brand. She let the resistance leave her hands one finger at a time. Destiny was not a room closing. It was a window opening onto a height she had been trained to fear. She could climb or not, but pretending there was no view insulted the mountain when they left the shrine. The world felt quieter because something had been decided, even if no one would call it a decision yet. The forest did not cheer. It merely allowed the path to become a little more obvious. The whispers retreated into bark, satisfied for now. Her mark cooled and settled, not gone, simply content to wait where it belonged. He did not speak. He did not need to. Choices had entered their bodies and would push out their actions soon enough. The fortress rose out of the northern rock like a command chiseled into a cliff. Not a castle built for pretty, but a stronghold engineered by people who had survived long winters and longer grudges. Walls leaned forward slightly as if to watch the road.
Towers punched up into a sky that pretended to be bored and failed. The gate did not welcome. It measured, weighed, and decided to tolerate arrivals it could not prevent. When they approached within sighting range, horns announced their presence in a tone that sounded less like celebration and more like accountability. The courtyard received them with the clatter and silence of a barracks shocked back to discipline. Men froze mid-task. The few women present straightened their backs until vertebrae clicked. The wolves in harness lifted their noses and tasted the air with an unease that read like prophecy's aftertaste. He crossed the threshold first, and the air itself acknowledged his return. The space changed shape around him in the way rooms do when gravity re-enters after an absence. Relief, fear, resentment, each emotion took a place at a long table and refused to leave. The council assembled with the speed of people who always imagined themselves walking into a crisis, and now had one that required real posture. Faces lined by years at court, by winters without decent meat, by victory's debt and defeat's cruelty. Some eyes brightened with gratitude that only the returned can command. Others narrowed with the practical malice of men who had been interim powerful, and did not wish to convert back to ordinary. The first to speak chose outrage as a mask for panic and pointed at Alara, like pointing could alter what had been written at Moonvale. The old name surfaced, the cursed one. It slid through the crowd the way oil travels water, coating surface, refusing depth. Rumor grew legs, then teeth. She had bewitched him, they said. She had dragged him away from duty and used the kind of light no good woman uses. She stood at the center of it with the composure of someone who had already been called everything. The words could not invent a new wound. He stood near enough to be counted as ally and far enough to remain king. His jaw had the set of a man who had considered mercy and chosen justice because mercy would be misread. Movement at the far end of the yard broke the theater. A rival arrived dressed in civility sharpened into insult, Draven of the western marshes. A Wolf who wore charm like a blade in a silk sheath. His challenge did not need ceremony. His presence declared it. He recognized power returned, assessed the woman beside it, and found a story he preferred to the truth. She was a weapon sent to finish what the enemies had started. He announced that preference with the grace of a man who wanted to be applauded for his insight. The air cracked. Wolves answered from behind gates. Men made room without looking like they were making room. The council's elders lifted tired hands to bless restraint and found no takers. The courtyard became a ring. Rules flowed into place, the old ones that had kept rivalries from eating the kingdom whole. No blades among men once the change began. No interference by cowards who preferred crushed tracheas to conversation. The moon climbed into its sudden red, a blood-tinted disk cupped by cloud. The world seems to prefer metaphors right before it intends violence. He dropped the cloak and the shirt beneath, and his body wrote its thesis in scars and muscle. Draven followed with his own exhibition, less honest, less earned, more vanity. Flesh blurred. Bone did its work. Two wolves stepped into a circle that had seen fathers settled and sons orphaned. Alara felt the mark under her bandage wake and pulsed just once. Not to intrude, only to announce that she was watching. They clashed with the purity of creatures built to solve problems with momentum and jaw. Draven fought like a story he had told himself too often. Showy, cruel, confident he was the main event. Kale she could finally attach the name without reservation. Fought like a history that had stopped including adjectives because none sufficed. He gave ground only to take understanding. Took damage only to place debt. Draven drew first blood and looked grateful for it in a way that made the crowd gasp. Kale wore the cut like a note in a longer song and waited for the measure, where it would resolve. The ring filled with heat and breath and the sound of bodies hitting ground. The red moon glazed fur and turned every movement into an omen citizens would argue about later. Draven reached for a kill before the moment honestly arrived. Arrogance tells time poorly. Kale punished the impatience with a torque of hips and a grip that forced a yelp out of the rival's throat. The crowd hissed in collective, involuntary empathy. The council pretended its hearts were stone and failed at pretending it might have ended there. A clean dominance asserted. The kind that stabilizes a season. But the world had not traveled this far for simplicity. From the gate's shadow, a second force surged. The saboteurs who prefer conclusions to be messy enough to write their revisions on. Steel flashed where no steel belonged. Men loyal to debt instead of crown lunged not at Kale, but at her. They understood power's arithmetic more clearly than the courtiers did. Remove the counterweight, and a king tips where you push him. She did not choose. Her body chose for her. The light rose from inside like a tide that had waited in obedience and now received orders from a floodplain. It came silver, not hot, not consuming clarity more than flame. It wrapped her hands and leaped to the blade aimed at her belly. Metal forgot its stiff education and sagged into something unhelpful. The attacker stared at his softened weapon, and then at death approaching from the side, jaws open, breath blessed. Kale took him from the world with an efficiency that made silence roar. Another came. She answered with a sweep that looked like gesture and turned out to be law. The silver ate shadow rather than flesh, stripped the charge from the rush, sucked the courage out of the men who had counted on confusion. Shadows tried to reattach to their owners and found no purchase. For a beat the courtyard stuttered, caught between awe and terror. Struggling to choose awe and defaulting to terror because terror moves faster. She knew while doing it that she was breaking every rule of survival she had ever written for herself. She knew the spectacle would be remembered longer than the truth. She did it anyway, because sometimes the way to keep blood off the stones is to accept that light must be seen. For a flicker she glimpsed herself from a distance, thin, mud unchanged to gold by any miracle, eyes too tired for legend, and understood why they would fear. Power displayed without a story to comfort it always looks like threat to those who hold stories as shields. When stillness returned, it returned wrong. Kale had forced Draven to ground and held him there against ancestral dust. Victory stood at the gate waiting to be invited. The council watched Alara's hands, not the rivals. The elders recovered their voices all at once, and doctrine poured from them like water that had been searching for a mouth. They called her what frightened men always call what they cannot command. They wrapped their fear in centuries and made it sound venerable. Before dawn, they decided she would be gone. Not for justice. For optics masquerading as order. The silence in her chest cracked and leaked something that felt like grief's older sister. The bond they had not named wavered under the weight of 100 eyes misreading it. Kale looked toward her through the afterglow of battle and saw what the decree had done. He did not argue on the courtyard's terms. He did not beg. He stood up from Draven's defeated body and returned to human shape with the refusal of a creature who will not be made into an exhibit. He met the council's stare and took responsibility for the order they believed they had issued. The set of his mouth said he would remember each face when prices came due. Snow began without invitation, thin flakes learning the courtyard's corners with a curious mind. The red moon slid behind cloud and left everything blue and exhausted. She slipped from the ring as the audience arranged its expression into relief and righteousness. No one stopped her. Their fear had asked for distance and been given it. She crossed the yard where ash and breath still tangled in the cold and walked beneath the gate that claimed to serve the realm and often served men. Outside, the first inch of snow quieted the road and erased tracks almost as soon as the feet made them. Her breath plumed into a narrow smoke that looked like a script only she could read. She did not look back, not because pride demanded it, but because looking back can break the fragile bridge a body builds when it must go forward despite everything it wants. The fortress receded into a gray shape, muttering to itself. The forest accepted her in the way it accepts weather impartially, but not unkindly. Days wore her like a task and she wore them back. She followed the river's lower reaches until the water widened and slowed, until sandbars rose like sleeping animals and willow thickets combed the wind with thin fingers. Men who had fought too long found her there, not by design, but by the gravity that pain exerts on those who will tend it. Rogues the world called them, wolves unclaimed, people uncounted, soldiers who had turned in their colors because their colors had stopped standing for anything but appetite. They watched the way she moved her hands and decided she was safe before they had reason. They brought injuries like offerings, not of worship but of trust. She cleaned wounds that told long stories and short lies. She set bones that had healed wrong and taught them to remember the original plan. She learned names and did not keep any of them, because sometimes forgetting is how you protect what is fragile. The light in her palms behaved as if it had been given instructions to be kind and quiet. No silver bloom, no spectacle. A warmth riding the breath, a clarity that helped hurt narrow itself into something a body could survive. She did not speak much. She did not have to. The river talked enough for everyone. On the third evening, the air shouted storm, and then delivered only dusk. She was rinsing linen in the shallows when the river stepped aside for a shadow that did not belong to trees. He approached as though the space around her had always been part of his map, unhurried, angled to accept a refusal, unwilling to pretend the reunion was an accident. The men she had set right went still in that animal way that means a hierarchy is about to be renegotiated. She felt it before she saw him. The truth of him, resetting the horizon inside her. He did not claim in front of witnesses what might break in a crowd. He let the picture speak. A king willing to walk into a place, with no banners because the person he needed would not go where banners asked. He stood a few paces away, and the river's surface wrinkled at his ankles as if it too respected boundaries. He carried guilt that had matured from apology into intent. He carried relief he refused to show because relief can be mistaken for victory. He carried a question that was not yes or no but how. That night the camp opened a circle for him because a body like his changes the weather, and fire knows better than to argue with wind. He sat at its edge where heat meets cold and tension becomes warmth. Embers reflected in the scars across his forearms and made each line look earned twice. She took the place opposite, not to oppose but to balance. Sparks lifted and became brief stars before the dark took them back gently. He spoke first, not in words she could quote, but in the shape of a confession that refused to make itself center stage. He set his wars where she could see them, villages he had had to abandon to save a frontier. The day he had declined vengeance and lost the loyalty of men addicted to it. The night the enemies had made the mistake of wounding him where hope lay instead of where pride lives. He did not ask for absolution. He asked to be seen accurately. She granted that without ceremony and felt something unclench on both sides of the fire. She answered by laying out loneliness like a map. The room in her chest she rented to silence. The bargains she had made with hunger and weather. The unremarkable kindnesses that had kept her from becoming cruel. The way the world had tried to shrink her hands until they could only carry regret. She did not dramatize the exile. She honored it. He received it with a stillness that made the night feel competent. Music rose from somewhere. Beyond the ring, a reed pipe that sounded as if it remembered its first river. It braided with the fire's low talk and found a rhythm that pulled bodies toward each other, without requesting permission. The rogue men watched and remembered their own older lives. The first dances. The stale sweetness of ale, the heavy comfort of knowing someone would stand between them and winter. Under those memories, space opened that asked to be filled. She stood because the music asked, and because her body had been too long a wall. He rose because he would not leave her out there alone beneath a sky pretending not to witness. They did not touch at first. They moved around the flame with the cautious grace of two dangerous things agreeing to a truce. It was not courtly, not trained. It was better. It was honest. Weight shifting to accommodate reality, breath measuring distance so that longing did not turn into harm. The men fell silent without needing to be asked. Closer happened, because both chose the same step at the same time and the ground approved. Heat built in the place where fear usually stands. Her hand hovered near his chest and found the space where heartbeat writes truth unfiltered. His breath altered in the fraction that matters. He leaned, not to take, but to offer. She rose not to ask but to answer. Nearness became its own language. He stopped himself a breath before mouths could make a promise the world would collect. Not because desire had offended him, but because wanting is not the same as ready. And he would not insult the moment by rushing it into something cheaper. Restraint shook through him like a current that chooses to stay inside its banks even when flood would be easier. She felt the tremor and recognized it as strength and not lack. He bent his forehead to hers in a simple geometry older than laws. Both bodies trembled. Neither pretended otherwise. When the music softened into memory, the circle understood and loosened. He sat beside her where fire turns logs into future soil. She leaned back until her shoulder found that impossible balance between bone and comfort against him. His arm settled around her with the care of a man accepting a crown made of something other than metal. The pulsing heat of embers sketched light along their profiles and made them look carved. She felt sleep trying to arrive and warned it that she would not be careless. It ignored her with the affection of a friend who knows she needs it more than she admits, her head lowered to his chest. His breath learned her weight and adjusted to carry it. The camp's noises thinned and then arranged themselves into a lullaby only those two could hear. Around them, men who had starved for tenderness looked away to give privacy, then looked back because hope requires witnesses. Above the moon, smaller now and no longer red, watched with a softness that made even the cold a little forgiving. She slept as embers fell inward, and the night did its quiet work. He did not. He lay awake and counted the places where fate had touched her and vowed to stand between her, and anyone who tried to touch those places with unclean hands. The vow did not need words, and so it acquired weight instead. When her breath hitched the way dreams sometimes make it, his hand steadied the hitch into rhythm, and the rhythm convinced the dream to find a friendlier door. Dawn, when it came, did not break. It unfolded. Light stepped through reeds, laid itself along the river like a blessing, and turned every healing scar on every body into a story worth finishing. She woke inside the quiet of a chest that had guarded her sleep, and understood the price a man like him pays to be gentle. He felt the comprehension move through her and accepted it as the beginning of a language that would not fail them when storms returned. Beyond the camp's edge, hoofbeats were urgency on the morning. News would find them soon. Councils recalculating. Enemies adjusting. A kingdom remembering how to panic properly when kings refused to die on schedule. They would answer all of it. But for one earned heartbeat, the world allowed them to remain exactly where they were. Two lives that had discovered an orbit and were learning how not to crash. The fire exhaled its last thin smoke. The river rehearsed its line for the next scene. And the day stepped forward, asking for courage and receiving it. The night of the blood moon began with ceremony and ended with ruin. The fortress glowed red beneath, a sky that looked carved from embered glass. Every torch burned higher than it should have, fed by wind that refused to behave. Wolves lined the marble terraces in half-shifted forms, eyes gold, claws half-formed as drums called the packs to order. This was supposed to be reverence, the old rite of unity before winter, a night for ancestors to walk unseen among the living. Instead, it felt like a verdict already rehearsed. Alara stood at Kale's side at the base of the great altar, her palms trembling against the chill of stone that had seen centuries of offerings. The mark on her wrist shimmered through the thin silk of her sleeve, catching the moonlight like a secret trying to escape. Around her, the council gathered in concentric rings, priests, nobles, generals, all of them carrying the uneasy stillness that settles before an accusation. Kale looked carved from shadow and fire, his crown resting heavy on hair damp from the cold. The blood-red glow caught the scar at his jaw and turned it into something prophetic. He had called this gathering to restore faith, to show his people the curse was broken. Yet even he could taste what was coming in the metallic air between them. Every heartbeat carried the echo of plotting. Every prayer sounded rehearsed to disguise a lie. The drums cut off at once. Silence fell sharp, complete. From the steps above the altar, the high priest raised his staff. The carved Volf's head at its top caught a drop of moonlight and turned it into accusation. His voice cracked the quiet like ice breaking on a frozen river. The words were ritual, but the venom inside them was new. The plague among our kin was summoned by her hands. The light she carries is corruption. She is no healer. She is the cause. A wave of disbelief rolled through the crowd, too disciplined to become noise but loud in every lung. The accusation struck Alara like a physical blow. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, betraying her body's panic. She felt hundreds of eyes scrape over her skin. Some wide with horror, others with relief that blame had finally chosen a face. Kale's breath shuddered. He stepped forward, but not fast enough to erase the hesitation that the crowd needed to see. For a heartbeat, he was a king measuring consequence, not a man defending the woman who had saved his life. That heartbeat was all it took for loyalty to fracture. Behind the dais, someone moved a familiar gait, the kind that knows exactly how to walk near power. His beta, Rowan, emerged from the shadow of the pillars. The silver of his armor caught the moon's full attention. His expression was mournful enough to look righteous. From his hand he drew a parchment seal burned at the edges. Confession, he called it. Proof. Whispers spread like wildfire on dry grass. He told them he had seen her channel flame in the forest, that her healing was theft from sacred fire, that the deaths that followed were the price she demanded. He spoke with the certainty of men who have already sold their souls for applause. The council listened because betrayal spoken in steady tones sounds like truth. Elara stared at Rowan and saw the smallest tremor in his jaw. The guilt of someone who had once believed her and now believes survival more. Cale turned toward him slowly, disbelief tearing across his features in increments too small to be seen by anyone but her. When he looked back at her, the question in his eyes was not whether she was innocent, but whether she understood how deeply he was being forced to choose. The crowd wanted spectacle. They wanted fear wrapped neatly as reassurance. The high priest lifted his staff again. Flames rose around the altar, thin columns of gold trembling like drawn blades. The red moon swelled behind cloud until the whole sky seemed ready to split. Cale opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to defend, but the word that came out was her name, and it sounded helpless. That single note of doubt sliced through her worse than any verdict. It said what the council did not need to, that even love can be postponed if a kingdom demands it. The air thickened. The moon's light deepened to crimson. The mark on her wrist erupted in heat. Around her, the whispers turned to murmurs. The murmurs to chants. Witch. Cursed. Blight. The sound became a heartbeat, larger than hers. She remembered her mother's warning. That power will keep you alive only until the world notices. The world had noticed. Her lungs locked. The smell of burning oil filled her throat. The flames at the altar leaned toward her, recognizing kinship. She tried to control the surge rising under her skin, tried to lock it behind the discipline she had built from years of fear. But betrayal is a key that fits every lock. The control shattered. The air tore open. Light burst from her palms. Blinding silver shot through with veins of blue. The ground cracked beneath her feet. Heat rolled outward, not fire but something older, raw intention given form. The nearest torches bent sideways and died. The council fell back. The high priest's staff split clean down the center. Even Cale shielded his face against the brightness that wanted to devour both guilt and grace. Within the light she saw everything: his hesitation, Rowan's treachery, the frightened awe of the crowd, the echo of prophecy carved into stone. The one who heals the beast shall bind the crown of fire and fang. It had never promised peace. It had promised balance, and balance always arrives through breaking. Her voice left her throat in a sound that was not language. The sky answered with thunder that had no lightning to justify it. Cracks spidered across the marble courtyard, light spilling through them like veins of molten truth. When it reached the steps of the altar, Cale's shadow touched it and burned white. She turned toward him through the storm she had become. He reached out, a hand reflex, apology, command, all at once, but she saw only the echo of that heartbeat when he'd hesitated. The sight hurt more than fire. She whispered across the roaring air, not with anger but with grief so deep it sounded like prophecy itself. You weren't saving me. You were saving yourself. The words hit him harder than the blast that followed. Power flooded from her palms, lifted her hair, drew the moonlight into her veins. The glow became unbearable, and in it something vast stirred, the ancient spirit that had waited in her blood since before names. It rose through her spine like a second soul stretching after centuries of confinement. The world bent around her silhouette until even the stars seemed to listen. Then she was gone. Not vanished by trick or retreat, but dissolved into the brilliance she had summoned, an eruption of silver fire.
climbing into the sky until cloud turned to ash and the night forgot its shape. The heat left behind scalded the banners, melted the council's seals, silenced every voice. The blood moon turned white for a heartbeat and then bled again. Slower, like exhaustion, Kale stood at the center of the ruin. The hem of his cloak burning, his hand still extended to the space where she had been. The stones under him smoked. Around him, priests shouted for protection, soldiers for order, courtiers for reason. He heard none of it. The only sound left in the world was his own breathing and the echo of her name, leaving his mouth like prayer and punishment both. The sky answered with wind hot enough to peel paint from metal. He shouted her name again, louder this time, until his voice cracked, until the sound turned into something animal. Somewhere far above, where the silver fire had broken the clouds, a streak of light fled eastward, faster than storm, faster than grief. He watched it until it disappeared and left him with nothing but the certainty that love, once tested by power, never returns in the same shape. The fortress smoldered. Snow tried to fall and melted before it touched the ground. The council knelt because there was nothing else to do when the gods reminded them how small they were. The high priest gathered the halves of his broken staff and whispered that prophecy had been misread. Rowan stared at the floor, realizing that betrayal buys time but never safety. Kale knelt last, not in prayer but because his legs refused to remember how to carry the weight of absence. His head bowed, his throat raw. He whispered to the scorched air as if it could answer. Alara. The wind took the name and scattered it across the valley. It would find her eventually, wherever the light had carried her. And when it did, the same wind would return bearing fire. Because betrayal is never the end of a story, it is the breath before transformation. The kingdom woke beneath an orange sky. Smoke veiled the mountains. Ash drifted like exhausted snow. In the hours after the blood moon, nothing obeyed its old rules. Wolves refused to shift. Rivers ran backward in places where the fire had boiled them. Men who had sworn loyalty to Kale looked at one another and saw strangers. And above it all, a silence ruled thick, waiting. The kind that settles before a scream finds its voice. Kale moved through the wreckage with a limp and a fury that refused to show itself as rage. His hands were burned, his crown gone. Around him lay the bones of the courtyard, marble split by the crack of her leaving. Every stone still smelled of her silver flame and heartbreak. The council wanted orders. He gave them none. Words were too small for the hole she'd left. Only the air seemed to remember her shape. By dusk, messengers brought worse news. The rival packs, those who had watched from their borders, now moved as one tide. Shadow beast creatures the priests called legend, poured from the cursed marshes to the east, following the scent of her magic like vultures following blood. The prophecy had ripened. Everyone could smell it. The Alpha will die by the flame he loves. They repeated it as certainty, a comfort disguised as doom. He rode out anyway. The moon had not yet risen, and he trusted the dark more than he trusted counsel. Armor felt like mockery. He wore only leather, and the memory of her touch at his wrist. The forest that had once sung her name now muttered it. Wolves fell into step behind him without being asked. They understood what kind of war follows when love is mistaken for treason. Miles away, the same wind that carried his scent found Alara. She woke in a crater of her own making. The forest around her was glassed over where the blast had struck. Trees melted into thin obsidian towers that whispered when the breeze passed. Her body ached from light. The mark on her wrist glowed steadily now, no longer a symbol but a heartbeat of its own. When she breathed, the air shimmered. Every leaf that touched her skin caught silver and released it. At first she thought she died and been refused by every heaven. Then the pain reached her, sharp and specific, the kind that belongs to the living. She tried to stand and felt the world tip, but hands unseen steadied her. They were not ghosts, but echoes, figures of mist shaped from the same energy that had broken free inside her. Ancestral, patient, half smiling. They circled her like guardians unsure whether to bow or to warn. Their voices layered into one. You were never cursed. You were chosen and hidden. They feared the balance you bring,
She wanted to ask Balance for what, but the answer bloomed before the words images pouring into her skull. Kale chained beneath a crimson banner. Wolves bound by collars of iron. A priest's mouth chanting her name as weapon. The shadow beast spilling through broken gates. The vision left her shaking. The message was simple. The world would burn either way. Only choice determined what remained afterward. She began walking north again. Each step drew power upward through her solace. Roots bent toward her like veins seeking pulse. She followed the trail of smoke and the smell of iron until mountains reappeared, Kale's fortress, now a scar against the horizon. The sky above it flickered with red that was not sunset. She could hear the war before she saw it. Claws meeting steel. Men crying out in Wolf voices, the deep, wrong growl of beasts that did not belong to nature. The first enemy found her near the ridge, a shadow-given muscle. Four-legged but faceless, breathing rot. It lunged and instinct replaced fear. She raised her hand. Light erupted in a clean line, neither flame nor lightning, but both, slicing the thing apart until it folded back into dust. Power surged through her like recognition. The spirit inside her ancient, now fully awake, guided rather than consumed. For the first time she felt control. The curse had become craft. Below. The fortress gates had fallen. Kale fought in the courtyard, half-shifted, surrounded by his remaining guard. Blood slicked the stones. Fire ate the banners. She saw him collapse to one knee, dragged down by three beasts at once, their claws sinking into the armor at his spine. The sight cut through her hesitation like a blade through silk. She stepped from the ridge and let gravity begin the descent. Wings of silver energy unfurled from her shoulders and turned the fall into flight. When she landed, the shockwave flattened the nearest attackers. Wolves and men alike froze, unsure whether salvation or another disaster had arrived. Kale looked up through the smoke, disbelief raw in his face. She crossed the ground between them, each footstep burning a clean circle into the soot. The beasts turned on her, drawn by light, but the light refused to be prey. She spread her arms, and the air ignited. It was not destruction. It was release. The shadow creatures screamed without mouths and dissolved into ash that glittered before it fell. The curse that had created them tried to retreat, but she spoke one word and it shattered. The entire valley answered. Mountains groaned. The river split and rejoined. The moon, climbing late, burned white instead of red. Kale's chain spells wrought by the priest's betrayal snapped with the same sound as her heartbeat. He rose slowly, eyes reflecting her glow. Around them, the surviving wolves knelt, not because command forced them, but because awe is heavier than fear. The high priest staggered from the altar ruins, robes torn, voice shaking as he tried to reassert control. The flame has no mind, he shouted. It will destroy what it touches. Alara turned toward him. Her eyes had gone completely pale, pupils swallowed by light. When she spoke, the voice carried two tones, hers and the one older than her blood. I was never your weapon, she said, and the words reverberated through stone. I am the flame you feared. The priest tried to summon his magic, but the ground rejected it. The circle he carved with his staff collapsed inward, swallowing him whole. The earth closed after him, sealing with a hiss that sounded almost merciful. The remaining council fled into shadow that no longer wanted them. Wind howled through the shattered gates, and lifted her hair in silver ribbons. She turned to Kale. The battlefield around them glowed faintly, as if remembering what light was supposed to feel like. He stared at her the way one looks at the horizon after surviving shipwreck, fear and wonder sharing the same breath. Then slowly, he dropped to one knee. Not as a king, but as a man recognizing the power that had saved him and everything he'd sworn to protect. My queen, he whispered. She shook her head. The glow softened, retreating into her skin until she looked almost human again. She reached out, took his hand, and drew him to his feet. No, her voice came quiet but certain. My equal. The words rewrote the air between them. The wolves, still kneeling, lifted their heads and felt something in the world adjust, hierarchy bending toward balance. The moon blazed once, sealing the vow. The war was not over. The realm beyond the mountains would wake to this new order with either awe or vengeance. But for this night, the prophecy was complete in a way none of them had predicted. The Alpha had not died by the flame he loved. He had lived because it loved him back. She turned toward the horizon where the first hint of dawn bruised the clouds. Ash fell softly around them like snow, remembering how to be gentle. Kale stepped beside her, the distance between them finally unmeasured. Beneath their feet, the cracked earth cooled and healed. The fortress behind them breathed for the first time in months. When she looked at him, the mark on her wrist pulsed once and faded, its duty done. For the first time in her life, silence felt like peace rather than exile. She had not been saved. She had saved herself. And in doing so, she had saved everyone else from the lie that power and love cannot share the same skin. The moon dipped. The dawn gathered courage. The flame within her settled into a steady hum, the sound of a heart that had finally remembered its own rhythm. Around them, wolves began to sing, not the song of mourning, but of beginning. And somewhere in that new light, Kale smiled, the first honest smile of a king, who understood that crowns mean nothing beside the hand that can burn and still choose to heal. Night bled gently into morning. The fire that had devoured the world now slept in the soil, its warmth buried under a quiet that felt earned. Smoke drifted upward in thin ribbons, tracing invisible prayers into the lightning sky. The battlefield lay still, a mosaic of ash, stone, and memory. Every ruined tower, every blackened tree carried the same silence. The kind that comes after truth has spoken louder than fear. Alara stood at the edge of the world she had remade. The silver glow that once crowned her skin now shimmered only in her eyes, faint as the ghost of lightning far away. Her palms, once burning with power, looked human again, small, scarred, and trembling slightly from the cost of what she had done. Around her, wolves knelt in reverence, not to a queen, but to a force they finally understood, a woman who had refused to be either weapon or wound. Kale stood behind her. Armor cracked, hands raw, but his gaze steady on her back. He had fought monsters and kings, but the silence between them now felt like the heaviest thing he'd ever faced. The prophecy lay broken at their feet, its words outlived by their defiance. They had survived, but survival never comes free. The wind changed, soft now, tasting of rain. It slid over her skin and into her lungs like forgiveness. She looked down at her reflection in a pool of melted snow. The woman staring back was both stranger and story. For a heartbeat she wondered if she'd gone too far. If there was any way to love someone after becoming something this powerful. Then she heard the wolves' low harmony rising from behind her, a morning song turned gentle, their voices braided with reverence. It wasn't for victory. It was for her. For what she had become. For what they had done to her and what she had done to stop them from doing it again. Tears traced the dirt on her cheeks, and carried a gleam of light where they fell. She wiped them away, not from pride, but from exhaustion. Love had survived, but it had changed shape, larger, quieter, harder to name. When Kale came to stand beside her, she didn't look at him right away. She didn't need to. His presence was an answer. And the question had been lingering in her bones since the night she found him bleeding in the snow. He said nothing, and still she felt everything. The war, the prophecy, the betrayal, all of it folded into that silence. It was the silence of two souls still learning how to live in the same story without burning each other alive. The sun crept over the ridge then, soft and gold, turning the ash into a field of glittering silver. Light caught the edge of her hair and haloed her in a quiet kind of majesty. For the first time, she looked small enough to be mortal and vast enough to be legend. She whispered into the new day. Not to Kale. Not to the wolves, but to whoever might be listening beyond the veil of this broken world. Power always asks for a price. But love asks for courage. Would you have chosen her? Or feared her too? Would you have stood beside her when the world called her cursed? Or would you have helped them build the fire that tried to erase her? If this story lit something inside you, subscribe to Crimson Moon by Benny.
Because here we tell tales that burn, and hearts that never heal quietly. The wind should have died with the night, but it lingered, moving through the ruined valley like a messenger that had forgotten which name to deliver first. Smoke thinned to gray ribbons that clung to stone, and for a moment the world looked peaceful in the same way an open wound looks calm once the bleeding stops. Alara stood at the ridge where sky met mountain. The wolves had gone to bury their dead. Kale slept somewhere behind her, the kind of sleep that only exhaustion can command. She stayed awake because the new quiet unsettled her. The moon had set hours ago, yet its reflection still shimmered faintly across the snow, as if it refused to leave her completely. The air carried whispers again, softer than memory. She tilted her head, expecting ghosts. What she heard instead was breath steady, human, small. Down the slope, in the cradle of the forest where her light had not reached, something moved. A figure no taller than a child watched from between the trees. The mist parted just enough for her to see a face pale as morning and eyes that glowed with the same silver fire that once lived in her hands. On the child's wrist, faint but unmistakable, burned the mark of the moon-born. The sight stole the warmth from her lungs. Prophecy was never finished. It only changed shape. Balance does not disappear, it multiplies. The child tilted their head, curious, unafraid. Behind them, shadows gathered, not malicious, merely waiting for orders. The forest hummed with the low tension of something beginning again. Alara felt it move through her blood, the echo of power recognizing its air. The wind pressed against her back like a whisper made of teeth. She is not the only one born of the moon. Far behind her, Kale stirred in his sleep and muttered her name as if he sensed the shift. The wolves began to howl again, not in mourning this time, but in warning. The dawn that had promised peace carried a different color, now brighter, sharper, tinged with blue flame at its edges. Alara turned from the ridge, eyes narrowing toward the forest. She could already feel the old restlessness coiling in her chest, the call to protect what she did not yet understand. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, answering the rhythm of the one she had just seen below. 2 heartbeats, separated by distance but joined by destiny. The prophecy's next verse was writing itself. The wind fell still. For a long breath, the entire valley seemed to listen. Then the smallest sound, footsteps in snow, too light to belong to a warrior, faded into the woods. Alara closed her eyes and let the silence fold around her like armor. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper swallowed by the horizon. Then it begins again.